Good evening to all the listeners at home, and welcome to this very, very special installment of the Emily Carr String Quartet's presentation of the complete quartet repertoire of Beethoven. The Emily Carr String Quartet, along with all of us here involved at Christ Church Cathedral, would like to acknowledge that we are fortunate and privileged to be playing for you and bringing this program to you from the traditional lands of the Lekongwin people. Now, it's almost futile to try to point out what is the zenith, what is the apex of any repertoire in Western music. But I'm going to do just that because it is usually thought of, or at least many chamber music aficionados and string players will say, that the Beethoven string quartets themselves give us the zenith of string quartet achievement. Certainly they continue to influence every composer of string quartets, from Beethoven through Brahms, through Bartók, through Shostakovich. And among these quartets, it's usually said that the zenith of achievement is in fact the Parnassus of the last string quartets. And amongst all of these, it's often said that Opus 131 is, in the words of Schumann, the extreme boundary of all that has hitherto been attained by human art and imagination. So in itself, it's kind of a holy grail of string quartet repertoire. And just a few little words about this. It takes us back into the world of late Beethoven. And by this time, Beethoven was still relentlessly experimental, innovative, and a maverick, but he had very, very little left to prove. It was interesting to read, however, that he was continually plagued not only by health issues, which we know well about, but also by financial worries and concerns, family difficulties, which we'll talk about perhaps at another time. But still he managed to immerse himself so completely in the writing of these quartets that nothing like them has ever been heard before since. Certainly this is the case with Opus 131 that you're hearing this evening. With late Beethoven, we also find somebody not only in total and complete command, mastery of the instrumental genres and structures that had dominated the classical era, but also embracing fully and mastering several of the more difficult genres and techniques of the Baroque, the variations, the fugue. And his complete and total control over every note of a large-scale work from the first note of the first movement to the conclusion of the last movement is nowhere more evident than in this work that you're going to hear this evening. It begins, in fact, with a fugue. There will be people listening who are thoroughly familiar with the language of the fugue and some who may find it a bit confusing. So we'll just say that it is a form of imitative counterpoint in which it is essential to treat all of the instruments playing as absolute equal partners. And you'll hear that from the beginning. The work immediately prior to this is called the Great Fugue. In German, that's die große Fuge, but gross doesn't mean the same thing in that language. This was considered at the time to be completely, almost obscenely, an Armageddon-like departure from everything that had ever been treasured in music. And so we've learned to love it over the intervening decades and centuries. But this fugue is completely different. By the time we get to Beethoven's beginning to compose this work, he has completed a selection or a collection of 3 quartets that were commissioned and written for somebody else. I read in one history that Beethoven was now free to pursue this work in his own way. But according to absolutely everything else I've ever read, Beethoven never felt anything but free to compose a work in his own way. And if his patrons complained about it, they would be put very firmly in their place. And certainly he did that more as he got older rather than less. So the first thing I'd like to say about this colossal piece is that it's in C sharp minor. Why is that an interesting thing? First, the only other work in Beethoven's output that is in C sharp minor is the famous Moonlight Sonata from many, many years earlier. Interestingly also, Haydn only wrote one work in C sharp minor. Haydn is a very experimental composer when it comes to keys, but he only wrote one piano sonata in C sharp minor, and Mozart steered clear of that key, period. It's a difficult key, to this day, according to the members of the Emily Carr String Quartet, to find your way around the fingerboard playing it. In 1826, it must have been really a foreign territory for string players. Also, of course, Beethoven will modulate, move around keys very freely, using lots of chromaticism, sharps, flats, naturals, double sharps, etc. So it would have been a little bit difficult for even the best players of the time. But there's another reason, and this is going to be for you music theorists out there. The leading tone in the key of C sharp minor is the note B sharp. And that is the same as the note C, which is the lowest string on both the viola and the cello. And the position of leading tone is a very important one. So this subtle shift in the expected sonority of the string quartet is something Beethoven will use continually throughout the piece. Another somewhat interesting departure is that there are 7 movements. Now, what I found out reading about this is that Beethoven, after he had completed the manuscript, and if you ever want to look up a picture on the internet of any of Beethoven's manuscripts, especially in the late period, look at it and behold how this music ever got to us and how his copyists ever managed to decipher it. But in any case, he was asked to give some sort of structural clues as to how this great big huge piece was held together, so he wrote down numbers for 7 movements. And they found their way into the published versions. But historians and theorists ever since have argued that in fact it's more like 5 movements with 2 of them connective tissues, the way we have a connective passage between the last 2 movements of the Fifth Symphony. Other people have said it's really a standard 4-movement structure with a really long fugal slow introduction. I find that a little bit difficult to swallow myself. But truthfully, there are 2 movements which are quite short and seem to lead from one movement to the next. But the next important thing is they are all played without a pause in between. It's customary for us to give the players a chance to relax, maybe retune in between movements, but that doesn't happen in this piece. And Beethoven had experimented with this in other pieces as well, the Fifth Symphony, many of the late piano works, etc. So it is a continuous piece, and when he sent the copy of it to his publisher, he actually said it was basically patched together from pieces filched from here and there. Now, actually, of course, it was an unprecedentedly original and ambitious work, and it may give us, through Beethoven's almost obsessive attention to detail and control, something of an idea of how he might have improvised in his own mind. So I said that there are 7 movements altogether. I'm going to say a few things about the music that you're going to hear. And I borrowed some quotes, some old friends of mine, Schubert and Wagner. So first of all, we begin with the slow movement, which is a fugue. Now, this is the most amazing fugue, and it is a testament to 2 things. First of all, that Beethoven had learned about the fugue, and it's a very, very difficult compositional technique to master. He learned about it in his early days in Vienna as a pupil of Albrechtsberger. I have to practice saying that name every single time I have to pronounce it. And Albrechtsberger was a teacher Beethoven sought out when he felt that Haydn wasn't paying him enough attention. And Albrechtsberger really rode Beethoven learning how to write the fugue. What we find when we get to the later period, when Beethoven is really using the fugue a lot in his piano sonatas, in his string quartets, is his almost uncanny and unique ability to weave together a fugue in the midst of all the other techniques he uses. So it opens with a fugue that is almost note for note the same as Bach's C-sharp minor fugue from Book 1 of the Well-Tempered Clavier. It also follows very closely the outlines of the B minor fugue from the same collection, and we are interested to find out Beethoven was very familiar with these works and had been since his childhood. And as of around 1817, which is 9 years before this work was completed, he was making the fugue, he had a sort of second incarnation of being a fugue student. So in this movement, which is, in my mind, a very yearning movement marked Adagio ma non troppo e molto espressivo, really slow but not too slow and really expressive, Wagner was moved to say that surely this is the saddest thing ever said in notes. You can listen to that and see for yourself. It's very haunting, and it will in fact permeate the subsequent movements. We'll then have an Allegro molto vivace, which moves up and down in terms of its key and has been described as being a music of euphoric joy and gratitude. The third section is only 11 bars long, and it recreates in instrumental music the feeling of a recitative, which is Beethoven had already done incredibly in the Ninth Symphony. In other words, an instrumental attempt to create the free rhythms of speech. It sets up the slow movement. And this is a set of variations, a deeply expressive set of variations in different meters and tempos on a sublimely simple theme that's presented by the violins in tandem. There will be a presto, and the presto is in effect the work's scherzo. Now, by this time, you already have noticed, none of these genres and structures is really unusual for the classical era. Beethoven did not depart from them in the late period. He simply explored all the different boundaries and all the different possibilities that they had. So There's also this passage that permeates it, which is marked molto, poco, adagio, which means a lot, a little slow. The Emily Carr String Quartet will have come to their own decisions as to how to interpret this very unusual marking, but we're also going to have a sound which is a little unearthly, and although we don't think it's unprecedented in terms of its never having been used before in violin playing and string playing, it is when the bow is moved to the bridge, sul ponticello, and it creates this sort of weird whistly, I like to think of it as whistling in a graveyard actually. It always sounds sort of spooky to me. And one wonderful writer put it this way, the sound of the 20th century, and sul ponticello will become almost a cliche in string writing in the 20th century, the sound of the 20th century came into the ear of a composer who had been deaf since 1816. Amazing. So the presto will fade into a brooding, solemn, mysterious adagio sixth section that will introduce the finale. And the finale, interestingly enough, is the only movement of the whole piece that is in sonata allegro form. It will end, first of all, with a second theme derived from the first fugue subject. Interpenetration of material from one movement to another is something Beethoven experimented with years earlier in the Fifth Symphony, and he does it frequently in the late period. And then finally, by what's called a Picardy third, he ends with a happy face, although it's still somewhat unsettling to my ears, a little bit brooding. Now, two quotes I'd like to give you. The first one is this. Beethoven had as his greatest fan amongst the great musicians of Vienna a young fellow named Franz Schubert. And Schubert, when he was in the last 3 weeks or so of his life, wanted nothing more than to hear this work played. Beethoven had died the year before, and this is probably the only performance given before many years had passed. It was a private performance, and Schubert said to one of the other people listening to it, after that, what can any of us write? And the work, as I mentioned earlier, had a stupendous fan in Richard Wagner. I'm going to read this. This is more about the latter part of the quartet. This is the fury of the world's dance. Wagner stepped over he went over the top as easily as most of us step over a garden hose. This is the fury of the world's dance. Fierce pleasure, agony, ecstasy of love, joy, anger, passion, and suffering. Lightning flashes and thunder rolls, and above tumult, the indomitable fiddler whirs us on to the abyss. You may find that in the music, you may not, but what you'll definitely are about to hear is the great treat of C-sharp minor quartet, opus 131, played by the Emily Carr String Quartet. Thank you so much for being with us.